going to be a great and important film. So now I'd like to invite our panelists up to the stage. Muriel, our host, Irving Ladowski-Berger, Patricia Paul, please come. My first question, as I stated earlier, that I think there's something fundamentally different about this time. Do you agree? We should start with you, Irving.
Look, the short answer is we don't know. And the reason for that is, if I look at what people have been writing for the last 200 years, we've had a series of technologically based revolutions. Carlota Perez in the UK has been writing quite a bit about it. Eric Bryn-Jolson and Andy McAfee published The Second Machine Age. John Maynard Keynes in 1930s wrote about technological unemployment. And in each case in the past, things didn't work out in the pessimistic way people thought. People did get left behind, and there was quite a bit of pain, but eventually society adjusted and moved on. Is this time different? Is the fact that these machines are not going after physical things, making us go faster, fly, stronger, but are going after cognitive abilities, intelligence? Is this different, or in the end, machines are machines? And at that point, what I have found when talking to people is you have the techno-optimists, and I'm one of them. I think Eric and Andy are also among those, and they say, we don't know how, but we'll get through this one as well. And then you have the pessimists who say, well, the singularity, at one point we face an extreme pessimist, or they say, vote for me and I'll get rid of the bad people who are taking your jobs. By the way, which through history that has happened. Look at fascism in Europe and racism in this country. So we've seen these movies, and in the past they ended much better than we feared. And right now we don't know. Is this different or not? I just don't know. I'm on the optimistic camp.
Patricia.
So I'm going to suggest that this time is different, but I'm also going to suggest that it's not really about whether the techno-optimists are right or the techno-pessimists are right. It's about what do we, and I literally mean we, do to shape an outcome, because either group could be right depending upon what we do. And my thought is that it's likely that things are different this time. As you mentioned, intellectual work is being automated. I would suggest that emotional work is going to be automated even more rapidly than the intellectual work. And I think we as individuals tend to underestimate how fast we might be replaced this time, because we all have this sort of egocentric, no one can do my job kind of view. But the way that it looks this time is not a simple, someone at a spinning wheel is replaced by a mill, where it's a very literal replacement. Instead, it's sort of a unbundling of tasks, and the lower level is automated, and then the next and the next in a chunking process that also includes intellectual and automated work. And I think it makes the dynamic of technological unemployment almost invisible, because it's not like a shiny robot Jim Clark walks in and takes his job. Instead, it's one set of tasks, another. And I think what happens, and this is to your point about the politics, is that individual workers just experience it as a worse and worse market for their labor. They don't realize that because of automation, where you used to need 50 professionals to do something, you now need one assisted by software. So they experience it as competition with other workers, and it becomes very brutal and Darwinian, when in fact the competition is with this almost invisible creeping technology. And I'm going to suggest that it's not at all accidental, and there's a lot of sort of interviews and other evidence to suggest that it's not accidental that some of the robots and software that come in to take specific tasks are deliberately very unthreatening. When you roll out Ross, the digital associate, the marketing is, Ross is not here to take your job, he's here to help you. And I just think that when someone says to us, I'm not here to replace you, there should be some immediate skepticism, you know. And so what I think is happening now politically, you see the rise of fascist Trumpism, and I'm going to suggest that as the professional classes are affected, we are not somehow magically immune to that fascist pull. I'm going to say something edgier and suggest that that is in fact already manifesting in a very shiny Silicon Valley way in certain circles. You already see rumblings that look a bit like that. But I'm not a techno-pessimist. I think it is up to us to reshape it. Throughout history, what is job, property, employment, how these things are allocated and divided. Safety nets, but also if my job is de-skilled because I do it and software follows me and vacuums up the skill, why am I not a partial owner of that? We can redefine property to enfranchise people and give them decision-making power. There is no particle or physical property called property. It's something we just make up, and we can make it whatever we want.
Before we turn to Nouriel, I would love if you can give a couple of examples of the law and in medicine, because I know that you've talked very persuasively about what you've observed in these two professions that were clearly filled with people who thought no one can do what I do.
Yeah, so law school and medical school, what all of our parents wanted us to do because it was so safe and so well paid, and that landscape has changed dramatically. So as the skills become unbundled, you know, again, there is no robot clone of a lawyer who can do everything, but starting with the lower level tasks like document review, you know, when I was a young lawyer, there would be a room full of 50 highly skilled attorneys going through documents, cursing their life choices. I'm not saying this was enjoyable work, but there they were employed. It's now one attorney who takes a sophisticated predictive software system and runs the software through the documents in the case and then says, you know, bad software, you made this mistake, go back and do it again. And they iterate it maybe 7 times. And they have then taught the automated system how to think like a lawyer, and that's the phrase that's used for that case. The next iteration, I'm sure, will be able to do that in any case without teaching. The same way that there are digital reporters, that will happen with brief writing. So what happens is you hollow out the bottom of the market, making the top of the market much more vulnerable to market pressure. You know, so for example, there was a high-level regulatory legal job, paid a little under $500,000. That's an individual who can clearly buy a home, send kids to college. They were replaced by a third of a paralegal and a piece of software. That's going pretty high up the food chain. And so the remaining attorneys are subject to being replaced on a gig basis because you don't need someone to do A to Z. You only need them to do Z. And with that gig economy, I think, has come what I think of as sort of a middle-class masquerade, where people are desperately trying to maintain that status. In medicine, I think there's a fascinating example. At your summit on unemployment, technological unemployment, I mentioned Cedasys, a mechanized system that allows one anesthesiologist and 50 Cedasys machines to do the work of 50 anesthesiologists. And the anesthesiologists, to their credit, did the math and said, we don't feel like we want, you know, only one out of a group of 50 of us to have a job. They organized, they pushed back, and they had Cedasys almost entirely taken off the market. This actually happened since the summit. So that shows that it is up to us. On what terms the technology happens is up to us. And I think if we do it in an unplanned way, where it's just chaotic, we end up with something that looks like Microsoft's Tay. Hideous, embarrassing, my God, we never meant for it to be brutal and racist like that. They should have. So Tay is a tweeting bot that Microsoft created. They thought, won't it be so cute to have a bot teenager tweeting? It's just going to be great. But they did not stop and plan in advance. And a lot of people who create these tweeting bots were like, you know, I plan so that if my bot starts saying, I love Hitler, I shut it down. It has some safety systems built in to make sure it does what we want it to do. For some reason, Microsoft did not. They ended up with a horrifying bot named Tay, and they pulled her back off the market. And I'm going to suggest that if we don't plan our economic build, we end up with the Tay economy. Our economy is Taying out, and it's no accident, in a sense, or it's fitting, that Tay's language sounds a lot like Trumpism. This is where you end up when you have insecurity and you don't plan.
Nouriel, you've just heard some interesting opinions. Tie it all together. What do you think is going on?
Okay, a lot has been said. Well, is this time different? Possibly in a number of dimensions. One is the one we have pointed out of the exponential speed. You know, this dislocation have occurred in the first, second, third industrial revolution, but the speed of change is much faster this time around. So the short-term dislocation of jobs, income, and so on are going to be, first of all, more radical. The second thing probably is different is, you know, when jobs in agriculture disappear because of innovation, went in industry. When jobs in industry went away, went in services now, those jobs are being replaced also by robots, machines, and so on. And when physical work became mental or cognitive, now we've said all those jobs are going to also be replaced by machines and so on. That's a second dimension. The third dimension has to do also with the, how to say, the distribution of the benefits. Because you could say all this technology allow the pie to increase massively, and therefore makes us all better off. But increasingly, technological innovation today, compared to the past, is more capital intensive, skill bias, and labor saving. And not just saving labor blue collar, but increasingly white collar, not just low value added jobs, but increasingly middle value added jobs, and so on and so on. So if you own physical and real capital and you own those robots and machines, you're going to do well. If you're in the top distribution of skills and you are among the innovators, you're going to do well. And then slowly, everybody else is going to be displaced. And I think that's going to be the significant difference. Now, in the third is John Maynard Keynes said, we shouldn't worry because all these technological innovations are going to occur. The pie is going to become bigger. Instead of working 40, 50 hours, all of us per week, we're going to work 30, 20, 10. And all spend time becoming poets and artists and actors and leisure and creators and whatever not. So we'll do leisure rather than work. But if it's true that technology innovation is capital intensive, skill bias, and labor saving, some of us that are in the top distribution of skill are going to still work like many of us do, 100 hours a week, because we'll be the creators and innovators, and everybody else is going to lose jobs and income. So this inequality we're seeing already right now, trade, globalization, now technology, is going to become more exacerbated. Now, what are the solutions? Some of it is going to be eventually, I think, redistribution. If the benefits are going to be allocated only to a small sliver of people, you have to tax the wealthy and the rich and redistribute to the others. Call it universal basic income, call it whatever you want to. That's going to be part of the solution. There are other approaches like saying if the machines are getting for free all the data that we are creating, big data and so on, who's creating it? Me, you, and everybody else. We should share some of it for ourselves, and that's how we reappropriate some of those property rights. But I think that in the meanwhile, the dislocation is going to be massive. And think of it this way. Take the United States and United Kingdom compared to Europe today. In US, the unemployment rate today has gone from 10 to 5. We're creating 250,000 jobs per month. In the UK, also, unemployment rate has collapsed, and we're creating lots of jobs. And guess what? In the US, the political debate today is on one side, Donald Trump represents the angry white collar. People are displaced by trade, technology, globalization. And on the left, Bernie Sanders will say all the people have also been displaced who are Democrats. In the UK, where you have all the job creation, they're so scared of the Polish plumbers that they want to leave the European Union, right? So this is in the US and UK. They are the best of the bunch among advanced economies in terms of growth, employment, job creation, you name it. In the Eurozone and Europe, instead, unemployment is 12%, 25% or 30% in Greece and Spain, no job creation, malaise, and suddenly you have extremist party of the right and left, radical neo-fascists, neo-Nazis, or extremely left that are coming slowly to power. And this is occurring today before robotics, before automation, before AI is going to displace more and more of these jobs. So the risk is that actually the political dislocation becomes so severe that then the damage economically and in terms of technology becomes more severe. So that's what we're facing right now.
Just to follow up on that, one of my primary motivations over the last few years in pushing this issue of technological employment is exactly the political dimension. Historically, most of the nasty politics, as I said in the past, has occurred when you have large numbers of unemployed people, particularly men, young men, who are easily manipulated through fear. But it's not just unemployment, it's economic anxiety. It's the feeling that you might be next that creates a larger pool than the actual rate of unemployed. And if the speed increases to the point which it's likely, driven by exponential technologies in a political system that's quite sclerotic right now anyway, and hasn't been responsive even at its most limber periods. We know historically that we're not going to make legislation that's going to be in time for that. We're going to likely be reactive. So it doesn't make me very optimistic about that. But on the subject, riffing off this about techno-optimists and techno-pessimists, to me, it's not, I actually find it quite persuasive, the kind of future that we might have. The techno-optimists have a pretty good argument to make about the potential outcomes in a society where a lot of these technologies play out. The techno-pessimists don't like to buy that argument, and I'm somewhere in between, and the place that I'm in between is, to me, a bridge. And the bridge is temporal. It's about the sequence, and it's about the size of the gap that we have to cross. When you talk about periods in the past where, in the end, things worked out, yes, they worked out in Germany in the 1950s and 60s and 70s after World War II. That was what the transition was.
Well, and Nouriel is pointing out, we might face some of those transitions in Europe now, with what's going on in
So how we make the transition, I think, is the interesting thing. So I'd like to ask you next, what do you think would be the bridge period? How do we get over this bridge period? What are the ways that we can transform the economy before it gets to the techno-optimist utopia? And so we don't go to the techno-pessimist dystopia.
Well, first of all, in fact, I've become convinced that if you are really a capitalist, like, I consider myself a market-based capitalist. I worked at IBM, I consulted with Citigroup, I'm involved with MasterCard. Those are not non-capitalist businesses. If you're a capitalist, you should be all for safety nets. Because if you really want business to thrive, you want a stable society. And when society is going through major periods of dislocation, the more you provide the necessary safety nets. However we call it, Nouriel, you mentioned universal thing, Denmark has something called flexible security, but Denmark is only 5 million people. There are lots of mechanisms we could implement that would make it easier for people to have a decent standard of living while they invent their own jobs. And we may be in a situation, Tom Friedman has written quite a bit about it, and I see this in the younger generation, many of you are in that generation, where nobody expects, like I did, you get your degree and then you go work for IBM for 37 years. Those days are way gone. People expect I have to invent my job. And what you don't want is to not have some kind of security. But we could do that. We could do that. Government can do that. The country is wealthy enough to be able to do that. I really think, because business generally wants stability, that business would support programs like this to do that. And I think that is absolutely critical. And then let me say one thing that I'm really wondering how it will work out, and I would like to hear Nouriel's opinion on this. At the same time that advanced economies are going through cataclysmic changes, the standard of living in emerging economies keeps going up. And it's possible that over the next 10, 20 years, we will have several billion people with more money to spend who will become consumers. Could that be an engine pushing economies into the future? Nouriel, what do you think? I'm sure this is something you must have looked at.
Well, initially, technology implied that trade and globalization spread to emerging markets. So jobs in manufacturing went to China and Asia, and even white-collar jobs, like all the kind of business services, and that benefited emerging markets. I think, however, in the next step, rather than trade and globalization leading to a offshoring of jobs, will be in a situation in which automation becomes so radical that even in places like China, where labor costs are now rising, most jobs in manufacturing are going to be displaced by machines. I mean, Foxconn, that builds in China all the iPhones, is already planning for the next decade to fire about 1 million workers in China and replace them with robots and automation. So the paradox of advanced economy is that we're rich enough that we can actually gradually decline. Take Japan, that had a stagnation for 20 years, but socially stable because high wealth, high income. The question is, if many emerging markets, the jobs, say manufacturing, and those are the first ones going to be gone, are going to be displaced before these people become rich, then China is getting old before it's going to get rich. And then that becomes social and political even more massive. So the first stage of globalization was jobs going from advanced economies to emerging markets, but I think that let's see the next cycle of robotic and automation replacing all those jobs, and especially in emerging markets, especially in manufacturing. So I'm not sure that there'll be enough income of those consumers to spend all that money, if that's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
That again goes back to the question of how the pie is going to become huge, right? If this innovation creates more goods and services much cheaper, so it becomes a question of how you allocate the benefits. And if we can do it politically in a rational way, maybe all of us are going to be better off, but you'll have to do redistribution. Otherwise, technology and so on implies this inequality for lots of reasons, whether it's trade, globalization, technology, winner take all effects, superstar effects. You get the benefits go to a concentrated number of people over time.
You know, let me also talk about something, and this may be way out of left field, but I read there was a very interesting paper in, I think, Foreign Affairs, that one of the major innovations in the last 30 years is the low cost of obtaining good entertainment. That you can get it in many ways, the quality has come up, and it's relatively low cost.
Case in point tonight.
Well, you know, I had more in mind maybe Game of Thrones or,
Not much different.
you know,
There's wonky entertainment.
what's going on in music. But seriously, the fact that, especially you have a certain degree of education, there are a lot more ways of spending your time that could be reasonable. Now, we also have discussed that, I don't know, in the last 100 years, society got convinced, and only in the last 100 years, according to in the movie, that you have to get a job between this time and this time, and that may no longer be the case. Society has to adjust to people working in different times, much more personalized and customized and entrepreneurial. So it could very well be that the old, very mechanistic industrial economy notion of life and work has to evolve to something where we don't have to feel guilty because, you know, Judeo-Christian thing tells you you're supposed to be working all the time.
On that note, Patricia, what might work look like? Both in the transitional period and then in the techno-optimist utopia.
So I think in the transitional period, what work looks like is going to be subject to, I hope will be subject to some intense political dispute. Because I feel like right now, when someone is displaced from their job, or they're desperately trying to put together work in a gig economy, or they're holding on to a quote-unquote real job, but to do it, they have to work 100 hours a week. And sort of, you know, one thinks of John Henry, you know, he can beat the machine, but at the cost of dropping dead of overwork. If those things are not spoken about, then we can't come up to a political solution. You know, there's the old saying that we make the road by walking. Mm-hmm. And if we don't do the political work of walking that road and figuring out what work should look like today, then the politics of shame does go to fascism. I think people are terrified to admit that they're facing economic insecurity. So I think where we are in this political conversation about the changing and disruptive nature of work is where we were on the environment before the environmental movement. Or it's like a pre-Stonewall moment where people feel an individualized shame and they don't realize it can be made into political demands. And I think what we need on the politics of technological unemployment is a Stonewall moment where people say, wait a minute, I'm not ashamed, I'm gonna vote based on this, and I don't know exactly what the future looks like, but we're gonna figure it out. In the moment of Stonewall, did anyone come up with the phrase marriage equality? No, there were a few decades of really hard, really brave political work before they could even imagine an end goal that looks like that. But in the process of politicizing those issues, what it looks like eventually in the techno-optimist world, I think, is a world in which things like making choices, creative choices, interactions among people is recognized as work. If you think of the boundaries of what's work, what's property, what's play, those are all going to have to be redefined. And that's okay, because property is redefined all the time.
But isn't it fair to say, again, I keep looking at young people, my expectation is their boundaries between work and life are very porous.
Right.
Am I correct?
Payment.
I'm sorry?
Payment is the only difference.
No, I realize. And we're discussing different ways of payment, some of it public policy, and some of it gigs or jobs or different things, as opposed to you go work to IBM, you know.
Yeah.
So that's part of the evolution, right?
I think it is, and I think that what people are going to start to see is, I'm skeptical. I'm just going to say I'm a little skeptical about basic income as the only answer, because I think if you just have a basic income model, it doesn't let people participate in shaping the economy. So I think what you're going to see is a model that starts to incorporate more elements like, for example, Juno, right, the ride-share service coming out, where if you drive for Juno for 2 years, you get equity. I think people are going to build out more and more of the economy like that, where sweat equity, data equity, and it's built into a kind of ownership where you have a continuing role in it. And
I believe, by the way, in Denmark, part of their system is not just you get a pay for nothing, but more you get transitional pay to help you find your next job. And it's very related. You do have to find something, but there is a long-term transitional pay. I think in Germany, if you were working for Uber for half time, you already would need benefits. They don't have just, you're either W-2 or 1099, there are things in between.
Well, in 10 years, all those Uber jobs are going to be replaced by self-driving machines.
But
Right, cars, so it's
that's
not
why
a question of
the,
income.
that's why the algorithms and the data, which is the actual value in the Uber model, an argument can be made that that should belong in part to the customers and the drivers, because these systems come in and say, hey, we're offering you flexible gig work, but what they're really doing is vacuuming up the skills and the data so that it can be more fully automated. So, you know, you can think of this as the Baxter economy, right? You take the Baxter robot that can be taught by a worker until there are fewer and fewer workers. And if the worker does not retain some ownership, then there's, you know, the instability of no income, but I think the equally deep human need to feel like I contributed and I'm doing something. And without that piece, which I think basic income doesn't address, I think there's a huge void. So I think there's a real need for a political or multiple political and social movements to say, what is this world of work going to look like, and what should property mean?
But
in
you're
the world of
essentially
AI?
saying we need to redistribute wealth. I mean, there was that image that was saying that today 62 multi-billionaires own more financial wealth than 3.5 billion people, half of the world population. And these trends of technology are exacerbated inequality. We're saying we should tax all that stuff away and give a share of it to everybody else. So we have all some ownership in the robots and AI corporations are going to create all this wealth, and therefore will be, you know, all shareholders. But you need to have a political decision. You're going to tax away those who have that wealth and redistribute it equal to everybody else. It's another form of saying a universal basic income. or a share of that wealth. Otherwise, you will have a political problem, no?
One of the
But
things
it means
that-
massive redistribution, right?
Well, on that note, one of the things that could be different about this time is in the past you had large amounts of unemployment happening or exacerbating during periods when the overall economy is shrinking. The total aggregate growth shrinks, and then you get unemployment. This could be a situation where these new technologies create potential for massive rise in wealth, which then gives the politics of redistribution different than in the past, where it's fighting over the shrinking pie. It could be dividing the growing pie, and that might possibly offer a smoother political path than we've seen in the past.
Well, you may or may not. I mean, take, for example, trade and globalization have led to overall benefits for everybody, but also there are winners and losers. If you are a blue-collar worker in low-value-added, labor-intensive industries, your jobs are all gone, right? So in theory, economics says you can essentially compensate the losers, and the compensation US was under the rubric of trade adjustment assistance, going to give you training, reskilling, so you get other jobs. And the unions, after 20 years, call trade adjustment assistance trade burial assistance, because it's done nothing for those jobs, right? Politically, we have not done enough to redistribute stuff to those who are losers, and now there's a backlash against it. So in theory, you can do it. In practice, the political system is much more inertial, even in the case of trade, let alone for displacements of jobs that are going to come from globalization and from technology. I think either we're radically changing the way we redistribute income and wealth, or we'll have a massive backlash. In political, there are only, I think, three paths. One path is that, in a democracy, populist parties of the extreme right or the left are going to say, I'm going to tax away all that stuff and I'm going to create massive distortion. That's one outcome. And we see it in Europe, we see it in the US, we see it all over the world with these radical populist parties, right and left. That's one outcome. The other outcome is the Hunger Games. The elite essentially puts everybody else in a concentration camp, and you make sure that they're locked up there, and you get all the benefits of all their productivity, and you're back to concentration camps. And that could be actually a political outcome. I have some clients of my consulting firm, our hedge fund managers, say, why those people, 50% of the population who don't pay taxes, should be voting, right? They're thinking about the political system in which only the wealthy vote, and therefore everybody else is going to be in a concentration camp, right? That could be actually an outcome as the powerful are becoming more powerful, right? Are we sure there's going to be democracy as opposed to going back to authoritarian? And there is a middle thing in which we're going to be rational and figure out ways of redistributing and giving a share of everything to everybody, and redefine property rights in a way that then we don't have those types of extremes of either populism or back to fascism and concentration camps, right? But we have to actively think about it. Otherwise, the extremes are going to be nightmare, political and social.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the subject of basic income just for a moment, and then we're going to wrap up soon, maybe with a few questions. This is a topic that is increasingly on the table, in part because it's a very interesting idea in and of itself, but also because there are not that many other ideas out there. So people are really grasping onto this. Remember, it's in many ways a reaction to unemployment. It's not doesn't give people meaningful things to do. It just prevents. It's the ultimate social safety net. It's the safety floor. So one of the things that's been noted about it is that actually people where they've done experiments, rather than them all becoming lazier, so to speak, because there's no incentive to work, if you price the level at the right amount, it's survival level, so you don't have to worry about survival. It gets rid of the daily or the hourly anxiety that much of the human population experiences today, and much of it has experienced throughout history. You get rid of that with the redistribution, but it's not high enough to really disincentivize you to try to raise your standard of living. But the interesting thing that's been observed is the level of entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
When people have the economic anxiety, they don't become lazy. They now want to become creative, and not just creative in leisure, creative with use of their time in
But that's why I believe if you're a true capitalist, that's what you should be supporting, because it's the feeling that what people will do with that is become more entrepreneurial, because you're taking away the fears here. So I'm not for the government invented crazy jobs that nobody wants. That sounds pretty bad. It's more let people invent their own jobs and provide the safety net, incomes, whatever, and the right things will happen. I mean, maybe it's not techno-optimism, maybe it's more faith in humans, as opposed to thinking humans are terrible and they won't do anything. Now, maybe I'm talking about the New York area, people are more educated, they have more things to do, you can go listen to music. Maybe we're seeing that playing out in the fact that cities are actually doing far better than small towns and the countryside in the US. Is that reasonable that everybody would agree? Small towns and the countryside are falling apart, and including drugs and life expectancy. Cities are thriving. Well, why are cities thriving? And it could be this effect we're talking about, that you're in the city. It could be that that's this moment you mentioned in the West Village where people hang out in communities and they help each other. And maybe that's the faith, that the government can be an enabler for that to happen.
So we could do a whole day or 2-day conference on this, and we did last September, and we're going to do it again, and we're making a film about it. But we're going to wrap up pretty soon. I want to give a chance for 1 or 2 questions of the audience. Please state who you'd like to ask a question of Nouriel. So we're very happy to have Nouriel here and hosting us, and many people, including presidents and prime ministers, ask him questions. So please take advantage of this opportunity.
Everybody's brilliant.
The rest of us have opinions, but I think we have a rare opportunity here.
No,
Please go ahead.
Too modest. Everybody's great here.
If I may ask, I know that judging by the name that I've given to the film, The End of Employment, does probably sound a little bit like a Luddite move, right? That we are anti-technological progress. We are not. I want to address something that Patricia mentioned, but I asked, my question will be to Nouriel, to all of you guys, is Sedisys, the Johnson & Johnson system that is the world's best, arguably, anesthesiologist, was forced by angry humans who were displaced out of the market. That system was better than human anesthesiologists, it saved more lives, and it costed 10% of the cost that actual human anesthesiologists in this country charge, making it that more difficult for people to afford surgeries. Anesthesiologists are a tiny fraction of population. People who get surgery is a significantly bigger part of the population. Should we be stopping progress just because it's hurting small groups of employment, or should we be rather embracing progress and coming up with different solutions for the hurt groups?
I think, just quick comment, the world is going to change. The world always changes. And the issue is not to be politicians and policies that say stop change or go back to the past, or that we are going to magically jump to the future. But it's about how do you have a smoother transition, because we're always in transition.
I would suggest that the purpose of an expanded political dialogue or a social movement is to create completely different choices than currently exist. So right now, the anesthesiologists had block Sedisys and block cheaper, better healthcare, or allow it and become widely unemployed. Those are 2 terrible choices. And this is my analogy to things like an environmental movement, pre-environmental movement. Build a factory and pollute, or don't build a factory. 2 terrible choices. So let's see what a different menu of choices would look like with Sedisys. Redefine property, which we do all the time, so that the anesthesiologist's expertise, as the anesthesiologists teach Sedisys to think like an anesthesiologist, except one that never gets distracted or sleepy, but put that equity in one form or another, put that ownership into the hands of the anesthesiologists over the long term, so that you do a sustainability analysis when you roll out new employment, the same way you would do an environmental sustainability analysis when you build a factory. That's what I mean by an example of creating a different menu of choices. So the savings could go to a mix of making the care affordable to people who cannot, equity for the anesthesiologists, and a nice big bonus to the team that invented Sedisys. There's enough to go around there. What we have now is a zero-sum game where you're either a Luddite who blocks it but saves your job and keeps your kids under a roof, or you allow yourself, you teach your skills to a machine, you're steamrollered, and you don't have your kids under a roof. Those are not acceptable choices, and neither leads to a techno-optimist future.
Yeah, and eventually you cannot stop technology. Even if a country was deciding to stop technologies, those technologies will be adopted by other countries, and they'll have a comparative advantage, and then unless you stop trade, and you end up like North Korea, and then everybody else grows and you are the one drifting behind, you're not going to be able to stop it. You have to figure out how you're going to make sure that the pie is becoming huge. It's a whole matter of just redistributing the benefits, and there are different ways of doing it. But you cannot stop technology, and I think that's impossible.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for hosting. Something caught me when James Hughes, who's one of the commentators in the movie, spoke. He asked, how do we value work? And when I listened to the difference between people talking about universal basic income and protectionism in general, because that's what the real opposite of universal basic income is. I think there is a third prong that we don't regularly explore. So just a bit about myself. I'm an engineer, and for the past 15 years, I've been at maybe a quarter of the Fortune 500. And if I leave your company, I'll leave with a gob of jobs, always. I've been automating processes and then adding on to those processes robotics. And I work in robotics and AI now, and I look at everything as a distribution problem. So whether it's value, which I think we're talking about here, or capital, which is a technology, I think we need to spend time focusing on, and I'd love to have L'Oreal and everyone else's thoughts on this, focusing on the distribution problem of value, not capital per se, not the protectionist aspects of that, and not universal welfare or basic income or unemployment insurance, or all these other ideas that come out of universal basic income. Because as humans, we do a very tribalistic, basic feat of teaching our culture to everything else around us, whether it's other humans or whether it's the AI and the robotics that we engage with. And in doing that, I would argue that humans have a sort of intrinsic value at the point that more than one of them exists. So if we are going to advocate for ourselves in the future, what we ultimately, in my opinion, and again, I'd love to have you all's thoughts on this, is to be advocating for our intrinsic value and ensure that we validate that by ascribing more ownership. So if we're capitalists, and I identify as a capitalist among other things like millennial, et cetera, I think that we need to allocate more ownership of the potential for capital to each other. So all of the creators of the emotional feats and the intellectual and I think a few other things were mentioned, but regardless of whether it's considered creative or work, we need to ascribe some value to that and then distribute ownership. And what do you all think about that? It has nothing to do with basic income, but it can validate basic income from a data standpoint.
Well, basic income is a first step because you have to tax those who are the winners, who own the capital, and give a minimum for those who don't have it. That's one way of doing it. And as we know, if technology is going to increase massively the pie, but it's capital intensive and labor saving, those who own capital are going to have a greater share of that pie. And inequality, by the way, is going to rise. We see it already now. There are lots of factors why those who are wealthy are going to become wealthier and those who are not are going to become worse. It's just the beginning of it. So you have to decide that maybe you take all the wealth of Larry Page and Sergey Brin and Eric Schmidt and you give it to each of us a piece of it rather than Google, Amazon, Facebook, and whatever being owned by 3 or 4 guys. And that's what you're saying, right? One way or another, the pie is becoming bigger, but the inequality is going to rise, and you have to allocate. Or you find a pricing system in which, as we create all this big data, and Amazon and Facebook and Google steal all of it, if they want part of it, they have to pay me for it, and so on. So there are other mechanisms, but at the end of the day, the pie is bigger, but there is a distributional problem. There are different ways of resolving the distributional issue, and if you don't resolve it, then the social and political consequences become very complicated. So.
I think if you talk about changing, for example, if I individually were to say to Facebook, like, I'd like you to pay me for the post, that would be really funny. But when a group of people says, we're gonna renegotiate the terms of service, it's very different. And that happens all the time. Restrictive covenants used to be routine in property sales. If I, as an individual, said, please ignore your restrictive covenant and sell to me even though I'm a Jew, I would get nowhere. But when a social movement renegotiates the terms of service, it works. And so we can say, wow, it really is true that if it's free, then I'm the product, and as a group, renegotiate that. And I think that, if you think of sort of 4 completely imaginary buckets of like the commons, property, jobs, data, we can move things around and renegotiate those terms of service so that that human value is recognized. And it also then is more politically palatable, because most of the extremely rich people I know don't like the idea of being taxed at 99% and will politically resist it. Whereas when you change the legal definitions and the values from the beginning, it allows you to pre-distribute in an almost invisible way. In the same way that right now, if I work at a place and they vacuum out my skills, that's an invisible pre-distribution as well. It just flows the other way. And try me renegotiating as an individual with a tech company. I mean, someone I know was just locked out of her PayPal account, and she can't get back in, even though she was instrumental in their going public. So it doesn't matter how much power you have, you're not going to renegotiate with a tech company by yourself, and that's the collective action. I don't know what a union of tech consumers looks like, but we can take some clues, for example, from the civil rights movement. I don't know if anyone remembers the signs from the civil rights movement that say, don't buy where you can't work. Maybe we need a few of those.
Mark?
Yes, doesn't this create, you have to think through this redistribution, because unless you solve this at an international level, you create asymmetries that other people exploit. Maybe Nouriel can comment.
Yeah, in a situation in which there is a political backlash against technology and you're taxing everybody and there is no innovation, somebody else is going to be innovating. So those are the kind of spillovers that have to be thought about it, not only at the national level, but international. And as I said, you can try to stop technology. Somebody else is going to adopt it, and the only way to stop it is to stop trade with the rest of the world, but then you end up into the Albanians and North Koreas of the world, and that's not where you want to be either. So it becomes also a question of international distribution. For example, a lot of the technology is now created still in advanced economies, or even more so in the United States. I don't know, out of the top 100 internet tech companies in the world, probably good fractions are in the United States. Now China, because they've restricted the access, have created their own Weibos and Tencent and Alibabas, but other countries have not done it, not so. So if these trends that lead to greater inequality become global, this global company, US based, are going to have a greater share of those benefits coming from the creation of these goods and services. So again, the distribution becomes an issue, and you see it already. Small way by saying, Google or Apple are not paying their fair share of taxes in Europe, right? Because they're shifting profits somewhere else. So that's going to become a global question.
We're going to have one more question, and then we're Christine.
So I'm an engineer and an entrepreneur, and my big issue is that I look at the US Post Office and I think to myself, I don't really have confidence in a political system understanding the tech world to the level to be able to make these broad laws or policies to help the tech world be better distributed. And as an entrepreneur, I can tell you, I was a co-founder of a company that took public. I've launched products within large companies and small companies. It's hard. It's really hard. And while from the surface it looks like, oh, you made all this money, for all the time that you're sitting there trying to figure out how to make the payroll work, how to get the product to market, how to get the customers to pay you, because large companies don't pay on time when you're a small company. So my question to you, are any of you entrepreneurs, and do you feel that, the tone sort of sounds like being an entrepreneur is easy and you're getting all this cash, and that, that I don't see how you would motivate people to take on that risk if you would take away the benefits of working that hard. Look at the the senior C-level people at Xerox when they did the turnaround, how many of them ended up with cancer and heart attacks? So it's hard to say that many of these people have sort of taken all these profits and that it was easy that the government should take the role in distributing them. So or maybe I'm misunderstanding.
Well, I think that there's a small percentage of the population, possibly you're part of it, that views the phrase distribution as a trigger word and automatically pulls back from it. I mean, distribution and redistribution exists all the time. That's what most policy is. It's distributing a lot in society and incentivizing and disincentivizing a lot in society. The historical situation is that there have been many periods when entrepreneurship was just as active, when redistributive policies were more active. If you used a phrase, take the profits, that of course is a trigger for people because it's the idea that that somehow that means taking all the profits. I think what we're talking about is finding a balance in our society where the income inequality doesn't get to the point where the entire society, which is what the incentive politically that Irving was talking about for capitalists, that the entire society doesn't collapse. The social welfare state began at the epicenter of the Industrial Revolution in Germany in the 19th century when, due to the unemployment that was beginning to occur in large cities, due to the early technological innovations and the new industries, there was such unrest and such discussions about the fundamentals of labor and capital, which led to the Communist Manifesto and all sorts of other economic and social movements around the tech unemployment debate at the time, which wasn't called that at the time, that capitalism decided in Germany, not because they loved labor, they decided to preserve capitalism, they needed to have some sort of safety net. So there's a long history of capitalism and those in power deciding that redistribution makes sense when the alternative is worse.
Yeah, and it's not just a redistribution, it's creating a social safety net. So workers got organized in union, unemployment insurance, pensions, healthcare, and a whole bunch of benefits that made sure that actually capitalism survived. In places in which those things didn't happen, like in Russia, you had the Bolshevik Revolution, while the enlightened bourgeois, whether it was in Germany or in Italy or in France or the UK, created the modern social welfare that make sure that then capitalism with a tinge of social welfare survived. And there is always this issue because otherwise market forces left to themselves are going to lead to radical inequality, and radical inequality eventually leads to violence, revolution, civil wars, and something worse. So you have always to call it redistribution, call it social welfare state, make the sharing the benefits a little more fair. It doesn't matter what you call it. Now you have a point by saying if we're going to tax innovation at 99%, there's not going to be innovation. Fair enough. And there are other ways of thinking about how you make sure that you're not taxing innovation to the point in which there is no innovation. And I'm myself a small entrepreneur. I know how hard it is to create a small business out of nowhere. Fair enough. And by the way, 99% of startups, fail, right? And only very few succeed, and all the rest. But those who succeed become increasingly bigger and bigger and more powerful. So,
the bad news is we have to wrap up the official panel. The good news is you're all in the same room right now, still, very close to each other. So you can ask us, you can ask each other, continue the conversation. I want to say before we wrap up completely, Get to the campaign.
You'll send us the URL?
Yeah. When we get to the campaign around May 1st, we will also be urging you to, how many people have ever seen Nouriel Vina do this? We will urge you to, if you were convinced by this evening that this issue is as serious as we think it is, we will urge you to up your pledge. It's up to you, but we will urge you to do that. And we will also be urging you, everyone here who's here tonight, I would love to commit to sharing the campaign with your friends and colleagues. Please, if everyone in this room got $500 from their friends, whatever you're pledging yourself, we can finish the post-production of the film. And the film can be ready, when do you think? Probably this summer.
By the end summer or fall.
And we will be, this film is serious, full-length feature, documentary, able to go out and influence change in the world, reach people at the highest levels. It's already got in the film people interviewed who are at the highest levels in society with that reach. This is some serious business we're going about, and you're a part of it now, and we want to help get other people involved in the process as well. It's got to happen. So, are we almost ready?
Yeah.
Good timing. Okay.
We're ready, all right?
Turn the button.
Artificial intelligence, robotics, and other emerging technologies will displace labor in the coming couple of decades.
The technological displacement issue is getting larger and larger and bigger and bigger.
The technological innovation is creating disruptions in virtually every industry, all at the same time, all over the world.
The old economic model is being radically transformed by automation and artificial intelligence.
A human cannot really compete with something that evolves as fast as technology.
Lifetime employment, being in one place, the economy of like consistent labor practices, that's going to be gone very soon.
The production of goods is going to be done by essentially no people.
There's no real reason to think that the vast majority of intellectual tasks can't be automated as well.
We're just going to have to accept the fact that a lot of our work is not needed to keep the world going.
Even if it happens to some degree, we need to pay attention.
Our political system hasn't always been the best at anticipating long-term change and preparing for it.
In a globally linked and technology-accelerated world, we can't anticipate nearly as well.
Yeah, I'm worried about robots taking our jobs, but more generally, I'm worried about inequality.
All the productivity that comes from the robot goes to the owners of capital,
creating widening inequality.
And then we get frustrated that society doesn't advance at the same pace as technology.
Humans and society needs to evolve.
We really need science fiction writers to sit down with the economists, and we need to put these two kinds of thinking together if we're going to have any hope of having a pleasant future.
If we can get over that bridge, what awaits us on the other side could quite possibly be incredibly promising.